Although the human rights doctrine is culturally imperialistic due to a tendency to force Western values on other cultures, there is a fundamental need to protect the basic rights of human beings based on our shared humanity. We propose a modification to the human rights doctrine in its current form to make the doctrine more reflective of global cultural diversity.
In 1948, the United Nations adopted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, a document that the UN self-proclaims as a roadmap to guarantee the rights of human beings everywhere. The need for a Universal Declaration of Rights became increasingly apparent after the atrocities of World War II. After World War II, the world was largely divided into Eastern and Western worlds. The Commission for Human Rights was tasked with finding a common ground between these two worlds, an undeniably monumental task. While 50 member states were present during the final drafting, the Commission of Human Rights, who were tasked with drafting the original International Bill of Human Rights, was composed of a mere 18 representatives. The final drafting committee was comprised of representatives from 9 member states. Eleanor Roosevelt is widely recognized as the driving force of the Declaration as drafting committee chairman, and was assisted by other members representing Canada, the United Kingdom, France, Australia, Chile, Lebanon, China, and the Soviet Union.
The Universal Declaration of Human Rights is a culturally imperialistic document that is reflective of Western values and principles. There was a lack of representatives from countries in the Global South during the construction of the UDHR. The language of the UDHR is Western and biased towards the principles of Western countries. The implication of these rights have a tendency to devalue non-Western cultures and depict non-Western cultures as backward in nature, and is politically liberal in its philosophical principles.
The conference in which the UDHR was created was dominated by representatives from Western countries. While there were representatives from the Global South in attendance at this conference, the dominant presence of Western leaders led to the creation of a document that reflected Western ideology. Mutua argues that even if it ratified power imbalances between the Third World and the dominant American and European powers, the United Nations gave the latter the primary power to define and determine world peace and stability. Mutua also says that the West was able to impose its philosophy of human rights on the rest of the world because it dominated the United Nations at its inception. Mutua discusses a possible reason for this lack of representation from countries in the Global South when he argues that the levels of power at the United Nations and other international lawmaking bodies have traditionally been out of the reach of the Third World, and even if they were within reach, it is doubtful that most Third World states actually represent their people and cultures.
The language of the UDHR is inherently Western, using Western phrases and words. This language allows for the creations of the savages, victims, and savior metaphor that is often reflected in the implementation of human rights. In this metaphor, the savage is the perpetrator of the human rights violation, the victim is the person the human rights violation is committed against, and the savior is, according to Mutua, a set of culturally based norms and practices that inhere in liberal thought and philosophy. Mutua also argues that when human rights norms target a deviant state, they are really attacking the normative cultural fabric or variant expressed by that state. The culture, not the state, is the actual savage.
Due to this description of non-Western cultures as backwards or savage, the UDHR allows for a devaluation of non-Western cultures. This devaluation is seen in the idea that these cultures are not morally compatible and in line with Western cultures, and are therefore inferior. Mutua argues that the advocacy of human rights across national borders is an attempt to displace the local cultures with the universal culture of human rights.
The UDHR is politically liberal in its implementation and philosophical basis. Countries that are not democratic in political structure are often depicted as backwards and more likely to commit human rights violations. In the savages, victims, and saviors metaphor, the state is often seen as the instrument through which an oppressive culture is forced onto a population. Through this description, the state is depicted as the savage. Mutua argues that using political democracy as one medium through which the human rights culture is conveyed, one is able to capture the imperial project at work.
Article 21, Section 3 of the Universal Human Rights Doctrine is an example of the politically liberal and Western language criticisms discussed above. This article states that the will of the people shall be the basis of the authority of government. This shall be expressed in periodic and genuine elections, which shall be by universal and equal suffrage, and shall be held by secret vote or by equivalent free voting procedures. This article is describing a democracy, as favored by many Western countries. This article devalues other forms of government that are based on traditional and historical practices.
To counter the claim that there was not a diverse amount of cultures represented when the UDHR was drafted, many scholars, including Cow, will claim that Western perspectives were not the only ones represented during the formation of the UDHR. While this may be true, there are representatives from only 9 countries that were a part of the UN's drafting committee. These 9 countries include Canada, the United Kingdom, France, Australia, Chile, Lebanon, China, the Soviet Union, and the United States. These 9 countries are not reflective of the world population, and the representatives from these countries had the means to attend this conference and were not necessarily representative of the diverse populations of people within the countries themselves.
To counter the claim that the human rights doctrine leads to the devaluation of non-Western cultures, Cow argues that there are areas of conceptual compatibility between human rights and the values that undergird a wide diversity of religions, philosophies, and cultures. While there are principles in the human rights doctrine that are found in many cultures, these principles are interpreted and carried out differently across cultures. Therefore, the idea of underlying principles that appear cross-culturally is not a strong enough justification for universal human rights doctrine that applies to all humans.
To counter the claim that the UDHR is politically liberal in nature, Scanlon notes that the fact that violation of human rights are not confined to governments of any particular ideological stripe both occur on the left and on the right lends support to the idea that concern for human rights is a ground for action that is neutral with respect to the main political and economic divisions of the world. Although it is true that human rights violations occur globally, this does not sufficiently support the claim that the UDHR is politically neutral. Human rights tend to be communicated and implemented in a Western political style, which leads to instances of forcing Western values and political structures onto other people.
Despite the evidence that the UDHR is culturally imperialistic in nature, human rights should be kept in order to respect the autonomy and dignity of the human being. Kant argues that autonomy is therefore the ground of dignity of human nature, and O'Neill argues that human rights constitute collectively the largest possible realization of human liberty and human autonomy. Rights allow for human autonomy and dignity through Schu's idea that basic rights provide some minimal protection against utter helplessness to those too weak to protect themselves. Sen argues that the notion of human rights builds on our shared humanity, and this supports Nussbaum's idea that we do want to recognize that there is a type of worth in the human being that is truly inalienable, that exists and remains even when the world has done its worst.
As we have argued, human rights are essential to preserving human worth and dignity, principles that are grounded in human autonomy. However, as Mutua suggests, in order to ultimately prevail, the human rights movement must be moored in the cultures of all peoples. While we believe that the underlying principles should stay the same, the UDHR needs to be culturally tailored. It is important to understand that the meaning as well as the appropriateness of the Declaration and Human Rights discourse is relative to the culture in which a particular situation takes place. By culturally tailoring the UDHR, we hope to preserve the idea of fundamental human equality, as well as the diversity that exists from country to country, as well as within countries. In order to do so, we must address the problems associated with disproportionately Western representation and include the voices that reflect the diversity in the thought of populations around the world, especially including those who live in countries with high human rights violations and oppression. We propose a random sample for selecting UDHR representatives. Through this random sample process, the voices of underrepresented samples will have a chance to be heard. Additionally, we are creating external validity, meaning there is a higher chance that the opinions of the people partaking in the discussions and the revisions of the UDHR are generalizable to the world population as a whole.